I think that understanding how artificial intelligence is misenchanting us can be very helpful today with all these questions and issues and fears and existential terrors going up. So this is to think about how the very dazzle of the technology confuses us, how it throws us into a tangle of philosophical questions by blinding us to basic things like what it is to know. And I think William Blake can help us unpack some of these issues and give us a firmer ground upon which then to approach what will no doubt be the tremendous impact of AI ethically, in terms of the way it escalates war, changes work, brings about great economic goods, but also, no doubt, great economic turmoil as well. In a way, this is to contrast what we call artificial intelligence with human intelligence, and to get a much better grip on what human intelligence might be. Intelligence, incidentally, not meaning cleverness, but the way that we consciously comprehend the world, bring practical wisdom to our lives, share that sense of vitality and capacity to live with the world around us, other creatures, other things. Intelligence, in other words, in the broadest sense, not mere smartness. The way that intelligence gets collapsed into mere smartness is in fact part of the problem. I think another advantage of this approach, thinking about what human intelligence actually is that it focuses on now, what we know, rather than anticipating speculative futures. No doubt change will happen, but it takes us from our power to understand what's going on, because in the debate there can always be the promissory note thrown in. Oh, well, it's just a question of time till an AI wakes up. Oh, it's just a question of time until a superintelligence emerges and it becomes part of us. Having debates about what it might happen in the future as a kind of dream, as a kind of sci-fi, as a kind of prophecy, even as a kind of informed prediction, takes us from what we know now, and I think inevitably narrows and confuses, and so increases the grounds for this misenchantment, which is so palpable at the moment. Also, focusing on now, what we know of ourselves, what we've forgotten about ourselves, brings a positive energy to the discussion. I grow increasingly wary when debates about what's happening now are fed by fear. It takes us into a vicious spiral where we can't see clearly, where we can be overwhelmed, where understanding fritters away. But a positive energy helps us to engage with what's going on in the present moment, know ourselves more fully. It's expansive. We want to stand up more squarely. We want to engage more fully with life. And so that is another benefit, I think, of recovering really what intelligence actually is. We can, I think, approach these times with a degree of clarity that often isn't present in the current debate. You know, when a news media throws up a film speculating what might be like in 2030, 2035, presented to us with glossy graphics. No, we can recover what we know now and then approach these questions from that basis, from a ground, from a steadiness. And a key element, I think, to hold in mind is William Blake's great insight, which is the role of the imagination. The imagination for Blake is how we perceive things. There are no bare facts. There's always what they mean to us. There are no pure elements of sense data. They always come resonating with emotion, with feeling, with intuition, with meaning. And so understanding how we imaginatively engage with the world around us is also really absolutely important. That tends to get sidelined, and so that makes way for explosive fantasies to be taken way too seriously, I think. We need to understand that the imagination has us as much as you or I might have something of it. And so how we align with this flow of meaning and insight and wisdom and intelligence is really important. And Blake will help us to unpack that a little bit more. So, how to get going? Well, here's a very famous image of William Blake, the Ancient of Days. It shows a version of his mythical, eternal Urizen presented as a demiurge. And what's happened is that Urizen, confident in his own powers, trusting his own capacities of measurement and imaginative attention, but focused through those compasses onto that which he feels will deliver him power, or that which he must master. And in the image, what Urizen has lost touch with is the light that is pushing through the clouds behind him. He's lost touch with the wind breath spirit that's blowing through his great locks and beard. And I think that this narrowing of the imagination is a really important first point to understand the misenchantment that is developing so fast in relation to AI. Imagination is always working within us and through us. But what we need to understand is how we're collaborating with that imaginative unfolding. And I think that part of the problem with the discussion around AI is that our imaginations have been narrowed, they've been corralled, almost imprisoned to think about life and knowledge and the future of technology in a certain way. And what Blake would have us understand is that this isn't something that's happened recently, actually. It's a centuries old narrowing and focus. Blake often remarks that what is now emerging has long been imagined. And for example, in relation to computers, the imagining began at least 400-500 years ago with the work of figures like Francis Bacon, who longed for a perfected machine that could rule out, iron out, eliminate what they perceived to be human flaws in thinking, in calculation, in understanding. Now, Bacon, of course, couldn't build such a machine, but he seeded in this narrow, imaginative culture what is now apparently, so people would claim, although we're doubting that, being realised, the perfect machine that can think better than human beings, that will develop into a superintelligence. Because, of course, the metals and woods and pulleys and levers that Bacon had at his disposal to build machines has now been compressed into the silicon chip. And so that enormous power of the machine can be thrown with the enormous backing of the money of the tech bros particularly into fulfilling Bacon's dream. So understanding though that it is a dream that is guiding us rather than, say, sense, rather than understanding who we are, rather than even intelligence, I think that's an important first step. This whole Urizenic world, it builds an environment in which the dream of the perfect superintelligence itself makes more and more, in inverted commas, sense. You know, it's an environment that works transactionally, as if that's the prime mode in which we human beings interact. It's an environment in which laws govern everything from governance to morality to the mind itself. And of course, laws can be represented in digital systems, and so that creates the dream that somehow all these things can be controlled by digital systems, governance, the way the mind works, morality, and so on. And it also leads to an uncoupling, therefore, from the world, from others, and indeed from ourselves, because our intelligence isn't like that. There's a small part of it that may be transactional on occasion, but mostly we lean into life by participating in it, by feeling it, by responding to it, by that which feels expansive of our souls, as opposed to that which feels like it narrows. And similarly, you know, transactional morality, as if there are somewhere a system of laws that would govern all behaviour. We don't work like that. We work feeling love, feeling hate, feeling jealousy, alert to the beautiful, to that which is good. And we learn a practical wisdom. That's part of our intelligence in terms of the way that how we relate to others, how we relate to the moral, to the wider world. And when it gets reduced to a kind of naked morality, either in the hope that that can control us or it can control the machines, we've already so narrowed our imaginative capacity to deal with life that we're on hiding to nothing. Sort of the failure is built in, not because the machine is going to take over, but because we've already contracted our sense of who we are. And the dazzlement of AI and so on, the misenchantment that impressive, no doubt, impressive technology brings, that can take a hold and we lose touch with the true nature of our intelligence. So let me unpack that a little bit further by considering half a dozen factors or so in which human intelligence is sui generis compared to what a machine can do, artificial intelligence, large language models and so on. And here's another image of Blake to get us going on that. It's the image of his hero, Loss, engaging with his spectre. Now, Loss for Blake is the figure that tries to stay in touch with the wider intelligence, with the light, who knows that there's more to being human than the spectre, which is the reduced imagination, the rational power, a kind of disease, Blake says, would have Loss believe. And throughout many of Blake's poems, Loss and the spectre are engaged in a kind of long struggle and battle, because the spectre is actually part of Loss. Our reason is part of us. This hasn't come from nowhere. But rational powers and so on, the way that we narrow the imagination, must be understood. And there's a kind of war, a mental fight, as Blake put it. So that's an important part of what we need to engage with now. So how can we engage with it? Well, look, here's a sort of thought experiment that I think goes quite a long way to understanding how artificial intelligence misenchants, dazzles us. And it's a reflection, almost a meditation, on the speed of light. The point here is that a silicon chip, certainly at the level to which they've been developed now, operates more or less at the speed of light. It's not the speed of light in a vacuum, of course, but it's about a third or a quarter of that, the pace at which information can now move around a silicon chip. And the point about that is that it's almost inconceivably fast, even at the speed at which information and light flows through a silicon chip. The distance that can move in 1 second would take a human being over 2 billion years to walk. And of course, human beings have been around for maybe 300,000 years. So this is a fantastically accelerated pace of information exchange, quite more than we're able to comprehend, in fact. You know, the distance that light moves in 1 second, we would take 2 billion years to walk. It's unfathomable. And that unfathomability, I think, is a crucial part of what creates the illusion that the chip is thinking, that the chip might even wake up. It's the immense speed that's required to create the kind of magical effects that we know when we relate to ChatGPT, other large language models, other AIs. Their impressiveness lies not because they're thinking, but because of the speed at which they're working, that's unimaginably fast. And maybe that sense of the illusion deepens when you think about our mode of thinking, about how thought actually takes place. Because the dazzle of the technology fosters a kind of forgetting in us, I think, which is that we don't think at pace at all. Rather, we comprehend. And comprehending something takes place in time, but it doesn't require any time in order to emerge. Rather, what it requires is a kind of attitude of attention, an intentionality, a a quality of presence, being in touch, we might say. We contemplate. There's a certain amount of cognitive processing that goes on, but something will show up. It will be revealed. We'll see. We'll get an intuition. This is the way that the imagination works in us. And so our thinking, human intelligence, really only in a very secondary way has to do with speed, the thing that the silicon chip has in bucket loads. Rather, it's to do with presence. You might say that presence, comprehension, and intelligence are a quality of being, who we are. And the power that's involved is not the brute power of pace, but rather is the power of allure. We get drawn towards that which seems good, that which chimes with a sense of the beautiful, that which has the ring of truth. And of course, AI knows nothing about that for all the brilliance of its algorithms and statistics and so on. We have presence and a different kind of power at our disposal, that which draws us towards what's good, beautiful and true. It's felt in the soul, in the heart, as much as in the mind. We know it in our bodies, in our lives, as much as in our calculations. So what this sums up, I think, is that the next time you hear someone talking about AI and stressing the dazzle of the technology, either by fearful predictions or by a sheer demonstration of what it can now do, remember that intelligence, proper human intelligence, other kinds of intelligence that's in the trees, in the world around us too, of course, but certainly for us, is a kind of comprehension. It's outside of time, in fact, because what matters most is the kind of presence that we can bring to that which we're attending to. A first point. Here's a second feature of the misenchantment of AI, and I think it's well illuminated by Blake's image of Newton. Remember, Blake has this wonderful line of single vision and Newton's sleep. And this is the intense imaginative focus on the material aspects of existence. You can see a heroic looking Newton, because Newton's achievements were utterly remarkable. They were brilliant insights of the imagination. To see that the fall of an apple is the same as the turning of the moon around the earth is not at all self-evident, but the imaginative power that elicits that kind of law of gravity, second law of motion and so on, it is a constrained imaginative power, the focus that's needed in order to bring about the insight. And particularly it's the focus, of course, on material existence, the sense of a lawful cosmos. And incidentally, I think that this image also illustrates how the tech bros that get so often quoted in the media and predicting the future in such terrifying ways, remember that they're Newton figures as well. To get to where they've got to, they've had to narrow their imaginative power onto a certain reflection, a certain cut in reality, in order to bring about the technology and to lead the organizations that make that technology. So they really are not the best people to comment on human intelligence, because they've already narrowed their intelligence to get where they are. They're part of this wider forgetting, the guardians of the forgetting almost. In other words, the material vision, as if that's the way the world fundamentally is, forges a kind of mentality. And that mentality, I think, is at risk of taking over, certainly in the discussions about AI. It's what Owen Barfield called residual, unprocessed positivism. And it goes unconscious, you don't even realise it's there. You see it quite widespread in our culture. Whenever anyone talks about what's happening in social media, infinite scrolling and so on, they talk about a dopamine hit. Well, that's describing our whole psychology as if it was just a mechanism of a hormone. People will talk about being wired this way, or talk about breaking the code of reality, as if reality really is running like machine code. Or they'll talk about left brain thinking, again, as if there's some kind of mechanism that we need to understand and explode. You've already entered the mentality that's part of the problem in using those phrases. And I think that becoming more conscious of our intelligence and the way that it works is also to become more conscious of the way that the material machine mentality is deeply affecting the discussion, and so building the sense of misenchantment, the sense of dazzle, the sense that we're fated to be overcome by the machine. No, our mentality is at risk of being overcome by the machine approach, but we can recover that. And we can do that by considering again the nature of knowing. So here's a couple more images of William Blake's. On the one side you can see there the figure of Albion, the tortured figure bending back, and what's happening here is Albion is having the fibres of love pulled out from him by the daughters of memory. And this is Blake's way of saying that when we rely solely on memory, that which has happened, that which is in our minds, that which is in the constrained imagination, we become uncoupled from the wider world around us. The fibres of love that would connect us to the living vitalities around us, which you can see Blake has shown in the images of the sun and the moon and the stars on Blake's body. That uncoupling occurs when we rely solely on that which we remember. And this is relevant in terms of the AI discussion, I think, because AI depends on vast data banks of digitized memory. Data centers are what happened yesterday, the day before that. The memories stored and they're manipulated in immensely impressive ways. But we already know what happens when human beings and their intelligence get trapped in their memories. I work as a psychotherapist, and you could say that psychotherapy is helping people to become untangled from a world that's shaped solely by their memories. It may be memories of a traumatic past, for example, and what you hope to help people perceive in a period of therapy is that that trauma belongs to the past, and when it's understood to be in the past, to be a memory, that opens up the richest, expansive, enlivening facet of human intelligence, which isn't endlessly shuffling memories, digitally stored or otherwise, but is related to the second image on the screen here with William Blake. And this is the figure of Jerusalem, who is his spirited hero, and she is conversing with the daughters of inspiration. Now, the daughters of inspiration are in touch with the wider vitality. They're the communicators of intuition and insight. They're the imaginative expansion of who we are. They lead us to be in touch, not with the past, but with the present and therefore future possibilities and the other intelligences around us. And in this image, Jerusalem is half listening to the daughters of inspiration, but she's also drawn to a sort of dark, shadowy side of herself that Blake calls Vala. And Vala is a figure of herself uncoupled again from reality. And so Vala is depicted as throwing veils over everything, throwing veils over that which would inspire us, veils over that which would ignite our imagination, veils over our sense of who we are and what our intelligence really is. So this is an image of the mental fight that Jerusalem is engaged with. But she's going to turn towards the daughters of Jerusalem. She's going to turn towards the Gothic architecture, for example, that Blake loved, show there in Westminster Abbey, which he saw as awakening us to the living qualities of all that's around us. And it's unlike the neoclassical architecture of St. Paul's Cathedral, which is built on ratios, is a kind of machine approach to architecture. And William Blake really didn't like it, which, to my mind anyway, explains a little bit about when you walk in St. Paul's Cathedral. It doesn't make you feel alive. It makes you feel really rather intimidated. So this distinction between inspiration that discloses reality to us and memory that closes reality down, I think this is another absolutely fundamental dynamic that's going on in relation to artificial intelligence. We are being seduced and dazzled by an immensely elaborate system of memory. And we know that when that happens to human beings, it traps us, it makes us unwell, it fosters anxiety and fear. Because we're disclosed from that which is really the source and wellspring of our life, which is the present moment of intuition, of insight, this living comprehension and presence that our attention can bring. We need to remember that reality is disclosed to us not through statistic and calculation, though that can be a very useful aid, but through our active engagement with things. And that sense of activity for Blake is another hugely important indicator. Do we feel rendered passive in relation to what we're being told, or can we make a stance of active engagement with it? That is moving from mere memory towards inspiration. AI, you might say, is a vast play on memory, but intelligence, human intelligence, is an active engagement with inspiration. Now, just to say a little bit more about this relationship of the active and the passive, Blake was sure that nothing less than the all, the infinite, eternity's sunrise will satisfy us. We must align our spirit with the spirit that's in all things. And Blake captures this often in wonderful quatrains. He who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. This is also what he meant when he talked about seeing a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, holding infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. We can do these things. We can see through the imagination, through the inspiration, how the all, the infinite, the eternal is echoed and reflected in a grain of sand or a wild flower. We can hold an infinite thought in the palm of our mental hand. We can lose ourselves to a taste of eternity in an hour. And incidentally, I think distortions and perversions of this quality of our intelligence is very much at play in the way that we relate to technology already. So take the infinite scroll, for example. It knows that human beings have this huge desire. It's designed to exploit that capacity to reach for the infinite and for the eternal. But it thwarts the satisfaction of that great desire if you're not careful, because, of course, the screen doesn't feed, it tantalizes. It doesn't nurture this inspiration, rather it baits it. And it leaves us feeling passive, therefore, this common experience that people have when they've wasted too much time on a screen. It doesn't ask much of you, and in that asking, therefore, deliver much in return. That is very much what Blake means when he talks about having an active stance towards reality that then discloses itself to us. Our intelligence is an active demand almost, that we give all that we have, and then we will receive much more besides, because all that we have was always already from the source, from the wellspring, which we can, through our imagination, through our inspiration, through our intelligence, know. Here's another facet, which is a bit more esoteric, but I think there's something in it. Because whilst it's easy to talk in almost dualisms, the mind versus the machine and so on, the truth is that there is even a soul in the ultra-material reduction of the world. Urizen has a character, and whilst that character is often in pursuit of power, it's a character that easily finds itself distraught and worried and weeping as well. It laments what it's done. Perhaps that's part of what's going on with these tales of terrible tomorrows as well. The tech bros, even for all the power they know, are a bit Urizenic too, because they fear what they might be unleashing. So the soul of material reality really matters. The soul, you might say, even of the silicon chip really matters. And I think this is important because every so often you hear about the superintelligence that computers will supposedly reach being based on a kind of animistic understanding. If you feel and know the world to always be alive with its own kind of wisdom and intelligence, then why wouldn't the materiality of the computer itself have a kind of animistic vitalism that's going to wake up, that's going to be part and parcel of the environment that already exists? So that, though, I think, overlooks something really important, which is that the material reality of the silicon chip is wholly unlike the material reality of the wider world that the animistic worldview sees so clearly. The substrates upon which AI depends have been brutalized, have been purged of all that makes for life, and instead purified into really materials that are hugely toxic, but that enable the current, enable the data, enable the bits and bytes to flow through the switches, to flow through that which enables the algorithmic calculations to be made. I've put up this image from William Blake of a young Urizenic figure trapped in a kind of electrical storm, because I think in a way it can be used to contemplate the soul of the silicon chip. This is electricity that's been confined, unlike electricity that flows in nature, by the human will. Its forming spirit is one of confinement and a power that forces it to behave in certain ways, rather than a power that can inspire beauty and a sense of goodness, as well as the fear that, of course, electricity unleashed can bring, free electricity, you might say. We constrain these things. Think too about the toxicity again of the silicon chip. This is an environment in which life can't exist. It's poisonous. And that too, therefore, is going to form the soul of the silicon chip. It's a technology that also, I think, requires a huge amount of power in order to work and run. The data centers that might even require nuclear power stations to feed them. And yet there's something that our soulfulness can sense has become hugely distorted in that. I sometimes think that the meaning of the vast amounts of heat that must be removed from data centers, hence needing to use vast amounts of water, that speaks to us about a kind of unbalance, how the technology is twisting, perverting, forcing natural things to work in particular ways, and that shows up as vast amounts of energy needed to be put in and then vast amounts of energy to be taken out. This is not the kind of harmonious image that the animistic world perceives, where there's checks and balances, where there's rituals and patterns, where there's an active living relationship with things. No, the materiality of the chip is one that is forced by a narrowed imagination, incredibly intense and constrained sense of what it is to be free and to have a will. You might say that it's an environment, its forming spirit is born of strife, it's born of separation, it's born of digitized reduction, it's born of something wholly different from the ways that we can otherwise relate to energy and fire. Think of the difference between an evening spent by a living flame, a hearth, or the moonlight. This inspires the imagination. It fosters a kind of freedom in our souls, and is therefore a completely different evening to one that is lit even by an electric light, let alone one that's spent by the light of technology. Here's another image that I think helps to illuminate something of what gets lost when we become dazzled, misenchanted by the technological view. This is an image on the one side of Uthun, another of Blake's heroines, and she is celebrating her intelligence in the recognition that it's part of the intelligence of the world around her, and hence these wheat's heads, the heads of wheat, have got minds as well, represented in the form of heads. And that is part of what our intelligence could know. It's not about imposing something on the world. It's about realizing that we can give and share and receive from the wider world. But Blake is very conscious of something else as well, which is shown in this other figure here, the angel of revelation. Because this human desire that we have for the all, for the infinite, for the eternal, also has a transcendent element to it. It's a kind of immanence that's also breaking out always into the transcendent. And so the angel of revelation here is bringing down that insight, so that the little figure at the bottom is writing in his poetry, in his imagery, almost maybe a self-portrait of Blake. And I think that this all points to on the one hand, the need to remember that our intelligence has these two dimensions. There is the practical wisdom about how to live well now, how to nurture our lives, how to flourish, how to relate to others, how to know ourselves in relation, how to comprehend what it is to be even. But there's also this other transcendent dimension, because we human beings, maybe other creatures do too, but we certainly have a desire to live outside ourselves, not just live within our lives. We have a yearning for transcendence, and that is part of our vocation, I think. Not, you might say, just to build up and amplify and complexify material reality, but also to invest in the spiritual dimension. Our human intelligence knows that too. And the way that these two aspects were always brought together, and still are in many, many respects, is through the recognition that our intelligence responds not just to cognitive input, not even to great learning and literature, but to embodied ritual, embodied practices, myths that tell of great embodied journeys. And these facets of ritual and myth, they develop insight for us. The stories that can hold a whole process, even whilst we're at one point in that process, that's fundamental to our intelligence as well. It's all part of this living, dynamic, engaged, unfolding, not calculative, utilitarian, willed approach to life that I think now is inviting us to recover. Many ancient myths tell of figures who encountered electricity, energy, fire. Inanna, perhaps the oldest myth, certainly written in writing from Mesopotamia, talks about a trip to the underworld where Inanna learns about life and death, not in the scientific sense, so able to manipulate it, but in the relational sense, so she's able to bring that wisdom back to the world of the living, and so enable people to navigate a pathway through life, a practical wisdom, a practical intelligence. That is, a huge part of what we need now, but also who we are anyway. Rituals and stories and myths are ways of engaging the whole of us, consciously and of course unconsciously. It's about living in a dynamic context and not allowing the imagination to be so constrained. I think it's one of the reasons why practices like pilgrimage are appealing now more and more, even in an otherwise technological age, because just going for that walk with intentionality reminds us of something that's hugely expansive and widening. Blake says, seen aright, every particle of dust breathes forth its joy. He says that nature is imagination itself. It's bursting out all over around us. And by having better contact with that bursting out all over around us, it's a kind of, if not balance, even a remedy to the constrained vision that's put to us by the misenchantment of AI. Next time you watch a simulation of the future and feel its compelling power to grip your imagination, remember what has been excluded from that simulation. Remember, just by looking out of the window or feeling into your body, that which is always actively present to you, that with the right sense of our intelligence we can access as well. So let's draw these thoughts to a close about how we comprehend in the present, about how the technology can dazzle us because of the sheer speed at which it works, creating the illusion of thought, about how we need to not just live in a world of digitized memory, but one of open, porous, expansive inspiration. Thinking about how we can know the transcendent as well as the immanent, that a world can be seen in a grain of sand, fractally, if you like. And do that by reading some of Blake's poetry, which of course shows as well as tells of this wonderful vitality and intelligence that we know and can know more and more of, and so act as a way of grounding us in the discussions about, no doubt, the huge impact that AI can have, but by being grounded, not be fooled or led down these alleyways and mazes of promissory notes about what's going to happen tomorrow, but paying attention to the present, draw on all we are, and so make a better judgment and assessment of the impact of the technology on our lives. We can keep our imaginations growing, expanding, reaching out, receiving, open, porous, a hugely important facet inside of our intelligence that I think we need now. We always need it, but we always need it now. And I wanted to read a few lines from one of Blake's spontaneous ejaculations of this joy of life that he penned in a letter to his great patron, Thomas Butts. He wrote it when he was in Feltham, on the seaside, and so talks about how he was watching the sunrise on the beach one morning. And just as a little footnote, he talks about men here in this poem, but Blake uses the word men, meaning creatures that have mentality, the other etymological root of the word men. And you'll see that creatures who have mentality, he realizes, reach far beyond men and women to the things that he is perceiving with his expansive imagination, with his transcendent perception, with the power that draws us towards that which is good, beautiful and true, not just exerts itself trapped onto the world around us. Precisely the opposite is the freedom that Blake invites us. Feel it and hear it. Lean towards it. Long for it. Invite it into your life. And I think that it will help with the dazzlement, the trapment, the misenchantment that so much of the discussion about technology would otherwise leave us in. Here's Blake's words. My first vision of light on the yellow sands sitting. The sun was admitting his glorious beams from heaven's high streams, over sea, over land. My eyes did expand into regions of air, away from all care, into regions of fire, remote from desire. The light of the morning, heaven's mountains adorning, in particles bright, the jewels of light, distinct, shone and clear. Amazed and in fear, I each particle gazed, astonished, amazed, for each was a man, human formed. Swift I ran, for they beckoned to me, remote by the sea, saying, each grain of sand, every stone on the land, each rock and each hill, each fountain and rill, each herb and each tree, mountain, hill, earth and sea, cloud, meteor and star, are men seen afar. Our mentality, our intelligence, springs from a source and a wellspring that's throughout the cosmos and the natural world, inviting ourselves back into that living source, no doubt using artificial intelligence and technologies even to do that. But I think that is a fundamental therapy, practice, intelligent activity that we're going to need, as no doubt the fear and the prophecy about an otherwise lost AI tomorrow is going to bring.